Congressional briefing for the Secular Coalition for America. I'm the Executive Director, Edwina Rogers, for the Secular Coalition for America. And we're very pleased to have two extremely distinguished scientists here, Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker. And so let's give them a round of applause. I have some questions here. Some of them we have received from Facebook and from Twitter. Some the staff prepared, and then we also have the same for Dr. Pinker. So we'll go about 25 minutes with Dr. Dawkins, and then we'll go to Dr. Pinker. So are you good at just looking pretty? Can you just look pretty while we do Professor Dawkins, and then Professor Dawkins can look beautiful while we ask you your questions. And then we'll just have questions that will just roll through that either one of them can take a stab at it. But obviously they have different fields, so we don't have a lot of overlap in what they'd like to talk about. All right, so we'll jump right into it. So, Professor Dawkins, could you tell us, are there any gaps in evolution, and is evolution considered a fact?
It is a fact. What's not necessarily a fact is the theories of how it works. There is no question but that we are cousins of chimpanzees, slightly more distant cousins of monkeys, cousins of octopuses, cousins of earthworms, and so on. That's a definitely established fact. There are doubts and arguments about exactly what the driving force of evolution is. Nobody doubts that natural selection, the process that Darwin discovered, natural selection is the driving force of adaptive evolution, the sort of evolution that gives rise to good design, things like wings that fly so beautifully in an albatross or a swift, or eyes that see, ears that hear, and so on. But there's some controversy over whether all evolution is guided by natural selection or whether a substantial part of it is guided by random chance. So there are disagreements. There are certainly gaps in our knowledge of exactly which evolutionary steps took place after which. There are gaps which will probably be filled. Many of them will be filled. There's a rather big gap right at the beginning of the evolutionary process where nobody knows exactly how the evolutionary process got started. We know the kind of thing it had to have been. It had to have been the origin of the first self-replicating molecule. But exactly how that happened is, for the moment, lost in the mists of time. And the best we can do is to come up with plausible theories.
Okay, that's a great answer. So you mentioned two things, so we want to elaborate on. First, how did everything get started as far as the universe as we know it? So this is more of a big picture and not really how life got started.
Well, that's going back a much longer way. The origin of life probably happened a little under 4 billion years ago. The origin of the visible universe happened just short of 14 billion years ago. And is really the province of physicists, not biologists. So I'm talking more or less as a layman about that origin. Physicists talk about the Big Bang, which was the origin of space and time in our universe. It's not clear whether this is the only universe or whether this universe is part of a multiverse of many, many universes, which might have very different laws of physics. But as far as we know, as far as we can see, this universe, the laws of physics gave rise to the universe as we know it in this astonishing process called the Big Bang, which has been worked out by extrapolation of the expanding universe, of the fact that the galaxies are receding from each other. And so it's an extrapolation backwards to when they must have started receding. And the physical theories about the Big Bang, I'm afraid, are what people here in Washington call above my pay grade.
Okay, and then of course the other major issue, the origin of life.
Well, the origin of life is something that I can speak a bit more about, although nobody really knows how it happened. As I said before, it was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule, the first self-replicating entity. Once you've got something that makes copies of itself, accurate copies, high-fidelity copies of itself, then you have the opportunity for natural selection to get going, because if things can make copies of themselves, the ones that make the best copies, the ones that make copies that survive best, are the ones that we tend to see in the world. And so it's not quite sufficient that it should just make copies of itself. The copies must vary. If the copies vary at random, then natural selection gets started, because those copies which are best at surviving are the ones which survive. That's obvious, that's tautology. But what's more interesting is that the method that they use to survive may become extremely complicated. It starts off simple, it becomes more and more complicated. And it includes bodies, it includes bacterial cells, it includes us, after a very long period of evolution. Now, how did it happen? How did this first self-replicating molecule get going? It can't have been DNA, although DNA is the dominant self-replicating molecule now. DNA is too complicated. DNA has been called a high-tech replicator. It needs an infrastructure of the other major biological molecule, which is proteins, in order to work. Proteins are remarkable molecules which function as enzymes, catalysts. They catalyze chemical reactions, and that is vital for the whole process of life. All our cells are filled with chemicals which potentially could react with each other, but only do so extremely slowly, unless there's an enzyme that catalyzes and speeds up many-fold, maybe millionfold, the rate of a chemical reaction. So it's as though you had a chemistry lab in which, instead of having separate bottles of chemicals on shelves and you only mix the two that you want to mix, in the living cell they're all mixed together, but they don't react until a particular enzyme targets a particular reaction and makes that reaction happen. So enzymes are crucial. Proteins are brilliant enzymes, and they work because the one-dimensional sequence of building blocks of a protein, amino acids, determine by the laws of chemistry that the chain, the protein chain, the chain of amino acids, coils up into a kind of knot. And the shape of the knot, literally the physical three-dimensional shape of that knot, is what gives it its catalytic enzymic properties. And the shape of the knot is determined by the one-dimensional sequence of amino acids. And the one-dimensional sequence of amino acids is determined by the one-dimensional sequence of DNA in the famous genetic code. So there's a partnership between DNA on the one hand and protein on the other. And that partnership is hard to get going. There's a kind of catch-22, because DNA can't function without protein, and you can't make protein without something like DNA. Well, it can't have been DNA because of the catch-22. The dominant theory at the moment is that it might have been RNA. RNA is rather like DNA, and it still is extremely important in living cells in performing a mediating function. RNA is a replicator like DNA, but it also can do the enzyme function like protein. It's not as good as DNA at replication, and it's not as good as protein at catalysis, at being an enzyme, but it's reasonably good at both. And so the sort of favored theory at the moment is that the origin of life had something to do with RNA, and it did both the self-replication function and the catalysis function. And then later, DNA came in and usurped the replication function, and protein came in and usurped the catalytic function. And once that got going, then the whole panoply of life unfolded in all its glory.
Great, thank you. Brilliant. Generally, what are our chances of being born today?
Of being what, sorry?
Born.
Oh.
B-O-R-N, born.
Well, yes, a slightly funny way of putting it. I suppose what you're getting at is, I began one of my books, I think it was Unreading the Rainbow, by saying, we are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. Most people are never going to die because they're never going to be born. The number of possible ways in which DNA could permute to make people is, I think I said it was greater than the number of sand grains in Arabia or something like that. There is an enormous potential of people who could have been here in our place. So we are deliriously lucky to be here. So make the most of it.
Yes.
Because you almost certainly wouldn't have been here. And yet you are, with hindsight. There's a poem which I like to quote by Aldous Huxley, which goes, "A million spermatozoa, all of them alive, out of their cataclysm but one poor Noah dare hope to survive. And of that billion minus one might have chanced to be Shakespeare, another Newton, a new Donne. But the one was me. Shame to have ousted your betters thus, taking ark while the others remained outside. Better for all of us, froward homunculus, if you'd quietly died."
Thank you. That was the point that we wanted you to make. Now we all understand.
All right, so for people who are in the room that are trying to figure out education issues in the House, could you tell us a little bit about what caused your intellectual awakening and what caused you to become a skeptic?
Well, I have to confess my intellectual awakening, such as it is, was rather late. I didn't do very well at school. I scraped into Oxford University, and I think it was Oxford University that actually sort of gave me wings. And it was in particular the tutorial system which emphasized the difference between school learning and university learning. And I would say that for me, school learning was learning from textbooks, learning what the teacher told me, learning facts that I was supposed to know, and regurgitating them in exams. And university learning, which I didn't really cotton on to until my second year at university, was very different. It wasn't textbooks. We never had textbooks. It was going into the library and reading original research papers, following up the bibliography at the end of the research papers. And so penetrating the library in sort of networks of library research. Writing an essay at the end of the week. It took a week to do each tutorial. Then you wrote an essay and then took it to your tutor. And in my day, you read it aloud to your tutor. Now, the essay would have been on a rather narrow subject. But nevertheless, having gone into the library and read up this subject in the original research literature, narrow as it was, you as a 19-year-old undergraduate were the world authority on that subject, because nobody else had read it up quite so recently as you had. And you certainly knew or ought to know more about it than your tutor. Moreover, the subjects that I was asked to write about were not so much regurgitating facts. They were often controversial subjects. We often had to make an adjudication between two alternative points of view in the scientific subject that I was studying. And so you had to read the pros, read the cons, read the literature of people who thought one thing, read the literature of people who thought the other thing, and come to your own judgment. Write a balanced account, the kind of thing, I suppose, that this kind of skill you need to become a good civil servant or a good politician, a good briefer of politicians, I would imagine. So although I suppose I've forgotten most of what I learned at Oxford, what I haven't forgotten is the technique of researching a subject and evaluating contrary arguments and coming to a point of view, writing it all down in I hope, fluent prose. So I forget exactly what the question was, but is that the answer?
Yeah, that was yes, I think we could learn from that. So moving right along, where does our intelligence come from as a species?
Well, that's probably more of a question for Dr. Pinker, actually. I imagine you're asking me not so much the developmental question as the evolutionary question.
Just quickly back to natural selection,
yes,
coded genes, immortality.
Well, okay. Natural selection has found many solutions to the problem of how to exist and how to survive and reproduce, and every species has its own solution. And intelligence is by no means the only one that's been discovered. There may be only one, indeed there is only one species that has acquired anything like the level of intelligence or cultural sophistication of this species, Homo sapiens. But there are lots and lots of ways of making a living, and it took a very long time before a species emerged which did it our way. We don't fly, we don't dig, we don't swim, we think. And I suppose we need to look at the way of life of our relatively recent ancestors, which separates us from our closest cousins, the chimpanzees and bonobos, the other African apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, the other great apes, orangutans, and so on. We had a good start towards intelligence by coming down from the trees, where you live in a three-dimensional world, and you have to have rather precise calculating mechanisms to leap from branch to branch, that kind of thing. We came down from the trees, we colonized the African savanna rather than the forests where the chimpanzees and bonobos stayed. Something about that way of life must have equipped us with an expanding brain. The brain expanded dramatically, starting a little under 3 million years ago. Fossil hominids from about 3 million years ago, Australopithecus, have about the same size brain as chimpanzees. They differ from chimpanzees in that they walk on their hind legs rather than on all fours. Chimpanzees can walk on their hind legs a bit. And then something happened about 3 million years ago, and then you get a very dramatic swelling of the brain. Why that happened is a bit of a mystery. There are various theories. Some people think that you can explain it by just the demands of living on the savannah. That doesn't seem a big enough theory to me. Some people invoke a theory called... we shut down already.
But not until midnight.
Some people expose a theory of so-called Machiavellian intelligence, where there's a kind of evolutionary arms race between humans and other humans within the society, each person trying to outwit the other. We live where fish swim in a sea of water, we swim in a sea of other humans. We're intensely social species. And the idea of the Machiavellian intelligence theory is that you needed to be able to outwit your rivals for females, your rivals for food, your rivals for good living sites, and so on. And it became an extremely complicated sort of commerce of bargaining, grudges, obligations, debts, gratitude, all these sorts of things that started to have great significance in our social life and powerfully drove the expansion of the human brain. That's one theory. Another quite interesting theory is that it's sexual selection. The peacock's tail, you know, the peacock's tail quite obviously is no good for actually surviving. It's just the reverse. But what it is good for is for the male peacock to attract a female peacock. It's controversial exactly how that happened, but there seems to be no doubt that sexual selection, Darwin's other theory, is a very powerful driving force, and it does seem to drive evolution in extravagant directions. A kind of positive feedback which leads to an explosive evolution. And explosive evolution is a bit like what the human brain appears to have undergone. So maybe the human brain is a kind of mental peacock's tail. Maybe intelligence is sexy, maybe for both sexes. Maybe what happened was that humans started choosing their mating partners on the basis of not looking at the size of the skull, but of what it can produce, the manifestations of a powerful intellect. Perhaps language has something to do with it. Perhaps that we don't know how early language started, and Steven Pinker is much more qualified than I to talk about this. But it may be that the advent of language gave a kind of spurt to the evolution of the brain, or it may have happened after the spurt in the evolution of the brain.
Thank you. So what caused the rise of the mammals and for them to take over Earth? And why are there differences between mammals, like, for example, in South America versus Australia?
Well, the mammals were pretty shadowy figures in the time of the dinosaurs. They were small, nocturnal, and you would not really notice them if you plopped yourself down in a time machine in the Jurassic or the Cretaceous era. Little sort of scuttling, whiskery, nocturnal, shrew-like animals. The dinosaurs abruptly went extinct 65 million years ago, because, it's now almost certain, because of a meteor strike or a comet strike which caused a catastrophic, probably equivalent of nuclear winter. For some reason the dinosaurs went extinct, but the mammals didn't. Maybe only a few survived. It may have been because they were nocturnal, maybe they were hibernating. Something enabled the mammals to just make it through this appalling global catastrophe 65 million years ago, the end of the Cretaceous. They emerged to find a vacant terrestrial world. There were no dinosaurs. So there were a whole range of trades, a whole range of niches waiting to be filled. Carnivores, herbivores, tree-dwelling, burrowing, all the different ways in which you can make a living. And it didn't take long for these little scuttling shrew-like mammals to fill the dinosaur niches. They grew to become great big lumbering herbivores. They grew to become great big ferocious carnivores, and smaller ones and middle-sized ones. They filled all the different niches which the dinosaurs had left vacant. The shoes of the dinosaurs were vacant to be stepped into. But interestingly, that happened separately and independently in various different parts of the world. About that time, the great southern continent of Gondwana split up, and the continents of Africa, Australia, South America drifted away from each other and away from Asia. And that meant that each one of them, carrying its raft of little mammals, was a separate stage for mammals to step into dinosaur shoes. And they did separately in these places in different ways, but similar ways. And that's what's entirely fascinating, that the parallels between the evolution of the mammals in Australia and Asia, for example. Australia happened to be populated by marsupials. Marsupials in Australia produced all the range of trades that were being produced at the same time and in parallel in Asia and in South America separately, and Africa separately. And you can still see them. So there still are in Australia marsupial rabbits. They're not rabbits, they're marsupials. They're closer cousins to kangaroos, but they behave like rabbits. Rats, mice, moles. The marsupial mole, which burrows underground. It's nothing to do with our moles, but it has the same way of life, and so it looks like a mole and it behaves like a mole. There's another mole that evolved in Africa, the golden mole. Again, nothing to do with our moles, nothing to do with marsupial moles, as far as kinship is concerned, but it behaves like a mole, looks like a mole. And flying squirrels. You have flying squirrels in North America, there are flying squirrels in Africa, they're true rodents. In Australia, you have flying phalangers, they're marsupials. They look uncannily like rodent flying squirrels. They behave uncannily like, but they are marsupials, they're different. So Australia and South America and Africa provide magnificent laboratories, natural experiments for independent evolution because of the fortunate circumstance that the mammals stepped into the dinosaur shoes independently on these drifting apart rafts of biology.
Great. So what causes different races among humans, and why do you think there's an obsession in the United States on race?
Humans evolved in Africa, and until pretty recently we were indeed purely African apes. There were two major exeats from Africa. Homo erectus, which is pretty certainly our direct ancestor, left Africa, and you can find fossils of Homo erectus 1 million years old in Asia and Europe. Then there was a second out of Africa exodus, which was Homo sapiens, which evolved. They went on evolving in Africa. Homo erectus went on evolving in Africa, produced Homo sapiens, and we're all descended from them. The second exodus from Africa, which is probably pretty recent, it may be less than 100,000 years ago. There's very good genetic evidence about it. It's possible to trace back our certain parts of our genome which have the fortunate, from a genetic point of view, habit of not crossing over, not mixing in sexual reproduction. That's the Y chromosome in males, and the mitochondrial DNA, which we all have, but which we only get from our mothers. So those two sources of DNA enable us to trace ancestry and dating points of common ancestry rather well. So we know that we had a most recent common ancestor in the female line in Africa, maybe a couple of 100,000 years ago. Our most recent common ancestor by any route, not just the female line, is probably much, much more recent than that. When there was the second exodus from Africa into Asia, they spread to Australia, to North America, and thence to South America over the Bering Strait, to the Arctic, all over the world. Homo sapiens spread. And in a rather short space of time, they diverged into what we recognize as different geographical races. Despite what we see as the differences between human races, we are a remarkably uniform species, genetically speaking. It looks as though we passed through a genetic bottleneck, maybe between 70 and 80,000 years ago, which means that we haven't had very much time to diverge since then. The divergence that we see in this form of skin color and other racial identifying features seem to be rather superficial. Genetically speaking, we are a very uniform species. It's been said that if you pick out any two chimpanzees at random in Africa, they are more different from each other genetically than any two humans anywhere around the world. So we are rather uniform, but we appear to be very, very different, and our skin color can be very different, our hair form can be very different, and so on. I think we probably do need to have some kind of an explanation for why we have these differences in superficial appearance, whereas most of our genes are remarkably uniform. And once again, my mind tends to turn to sexual selection on this matter, as actually Darwin's did as well in The Descent of Man. So it could be that the superficial differences between us have something to do with sexual selection. Skin color certainly has something to do with the sun, and the fact that where there is rather little sun, as in high latitudes, you need to lose your dark pigmentation in order to get enough vitamin D, and you actually need sunlight, whereas sunlight can be bad for you, skin cancer and so on. And so in tropical countries where you are exposed to a lot of sun, you tend to need a lot of melanin to protect from sunlight. So there's undoubtedly some sort of environmental difference between the races. As for why, you asked about why we're so obsessed with race. This is coming onto the field of psychology, which is again Steven Pinker's field more than mine. But I think there is psychological evidence that humans form kind of in-group, out-group barriers. And if they can find any kind of superficial cue, label, with which to identify the in-group and distinguish it from the out-group, they tend to use that label. There have even, I believe, been experiments taking children and dressing half of them up in, green t-shirts and half in orange t-shirts, and they sort of form into green gangs and orange gangs, and under some circumstances there can even be some hostility between these gangs, which are arbitrarily selected, arbitrarily chosen, and given these superficial barriers. I chose green and orange advisedly, by the way. If you think about the Irish situation, if you divide people by some arbitrary label, and you call half of them orange and half of them green, and you then make a rule that oranges only ever marry oranges, greens only ever marry greens, and orange children only ever go to orange schools, and their children go to orange schools, and their grandchildren go to orange schools, and green children go to green schools, and their grandchildren go to green schools. You carry that on for 300 years. And what have you got? Northern Ireland. Well, orange t-shirts and green t-shirts is a sort of frivolous example. Skin color is less frivolous. So it may be that's partly the answer. But I think the point to hammer home is that the genetic and the evolutionary evidence shows that we are an extremely uniform species. My foundation has a t-shirt that says, "We are all Africans."
Great, thank you. So shifting gears here, do you think life exists on other planets, and do you think that we will receive visitors from other planets?
There are, by current estimates, about 10 to the 22 stars in the visible universe. That's a one with 22 noughts after it. With that sort of number, it would seem to be, on the face of it, rather unlikely that we are alone. Whatever the processes were that gave rise to life on this planet, it seems a bit unlikely that they would be utterly unique. They might be utterly unique, in which case it has the odd corollary that if we are literally unique in the universe, then that means that the origin of life on this planet was a stupefyingly rare and improbable event, so much so that we would be wasting our time even trying to look for a decent theory of the origin of life. We're not looking for a plausible theory, we're looking for a highly implausible theory, if we're alone in the universe. I don't think we're looking for an implausible theory. I don't think we're alone in the universe. It could be that as few as 1 billion other planets have life. And I say as few as, because 1 billion is a tiny number compared to 10 to the 22. If there are only 1 billion life forms in the universe, then the chances are they're so far apart that they may never encounter one another, and each one may think that it's unique. As for whether we'll ever be visited in person, I would have thought that's pretty unlikely. The most likely visit would be by radio or some kind of electromagnetic radiation, because that radiates outwards in all directions. At this very moment, there is an ever-expanding bubble, an ever-expanding sphere of radio waves leaving Earth. So far, it's only enveloped a tiny fraction of our galaxy, and we haven't had a reply. It would take a long time for a reply to arrive, by the way, so I think Stephen Hawking's misgivings that if people detect us by radio, they might actually come and visit us or eat us or something are ill-founded. The delays imposed by the speed of light constitute a pretty secure barrier. It could be that life itself is common in the universe, but technological life capable of broadcasting radio waves is rare. After all, it took our life form about 4 billion years before it reached the stage of being able to broadcast radio waves. It's also been suggested that life forms may be winking into civilized existence all over the universe and producing the technology that's capable of broadcasting radio waves, but then rather a short time elapses before they also produce the technology to destroy themselves. And so there may be little flashes of intelligence around the universe, around the galaxy, but they disappear almost as soon as they arise. When I say almost as soon, I'm using the geological timescale, of course, a few centuries maybe.
Okay, great. So we have slightly over 40% of Americans that believe in creationism. Obviously, this is holding many Americans back. So do you have any advice for legislatures on how that could be improved or changed or corrected?
This country is without a doubt the leading scientific nation in the world, beyond a shadow of a doubt. I can't help wondering how much more advanced this country would be if you were not held back by this astonishing burden of over 40% of the people who literally think the world and the universe is less than 10,000 years old. I mean, that is a staggering piece of ignorance. It's a scandal. It's an educational scandal. And I don't know what to advise. It's been steady. That figure has been steady ever since the 1980s. It doesn't seem to be shifting. Nearly 50% of the American population, if the Gallup polls are to be believed, it's possible that the questions are ill-framed, and that if you actually ask people a different kind of question, it wouldn't hold up. But as far as Gallup seems to be showing, it looks as though more than 40% of the American people think that the universe, the world, is less than 10,000 years old. I've compared that. If you actually do the sums, given that the true age of the world is 4.6 billion years, if you think that the world is only 10,000 years old, that's equivalent to saying that the width of North America from, say, Washington to San Francisco is 8 yards. That's the scale of the error we're talking about. It's not a small error. It's a gigantic, ridiculous error. It's an educational scandal, as I say. And I understand the problem may lie in the fact that school education policy is controlled by local school boards, who tend to be controlled by locally elected, school boards are, is that right? They're locally elected. And so in particular districts, it may be that the electors are electing ignoramuses onto school boards. I think part of the problem, I am told, is that textbooks are controlled by one or two big states who decree which textbooks should be used in the public schools in those states. And so there's enormous political effort put in by these ignoramuses into determining which textbooks should be used and literally censoring textbooks. Sometimes the word evolution is changed into, I don't know, was it changed into modification or descent with modification or something like that, which means the same thing. But the ignoramuses don't realize because they don't know that is evolution. A wonderful story, it was told me by my colleague John Endler, who's a distinguished American biologist. He was on an internal flight in this country, and he got talking to his neighbor in the plane. And they got talking about what they did, and the neighbor asked Endler what he did, and he told him about his research, which was on guppies, small freshwater fish, in the streams of Trinidad and Venezuela. And what Endler told him was that in those streams where the guppies have predators, the guppies tend to be drably coloured, camouflaged. In those streams where there are no predators, as it happens, no predators, the guppies become brightly coloured, like peacocks. And the reason is that in the streams where there are no predators, sexual selection by females, has free play and can cause the male guppies to become peacock guppies. But where there are predators, the brightly coloured ones are easily caught, or easily seen by the predators, and so they remain drab. And Endler did fascinating experiments in which he transplanted guppies from one kind of stream to the other. And within about 11 years, the guppies had changed. They'd actually changed into either brightly coloured or whatever it was. Well, the man on guppies, on Endler's neighbouring sea, was fascinated by it. He said, gee, that's really interesting. There must be some theory behind that. So then Endler showed his hand and said, yes, it's called Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And the man said, I don't believe in that. Terminated the conversation. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we're up against.
Thank you. So we'll pick up the pace because we've got the questions coming in, and we're going to bring in Mr. Pinker. Do you find it harmful for children to be labeled with their religions, with their parents' religion, and should they be taught skepticism, children?
Me?
Yeah, it's you.
Yes, I think it is wicked to make the assumption that a child has the same religion as its parents. We all do it. We all talk about Catholic children or Muslim children. Even 4-year-old, 1-year-old children are called Catholic babies or Catholic children. Why do we do it? Suppose I were to talk to you about an existentialist child, a logical positivist child, a postmodernist child. You would say, how ridiculous, a child can't possibly be an existentialist, it's too young. And yet we all buy into the fiction that a child is to be labelled with the religion of its parents. If only we could break that cycle. the world would be a better place, and it's difficult to break that cycle as long as we all, secularists or whatever we are, buy into the fiction that a child is to be labelled with the religion of its parents. You should no more call a child a Catholic child than you should call a child a existentialist child. What a child is a child of Catholic parents, and that's the phrase that should be used. We need to raise consciousness about this. When you hear at a dinner party or meet somebody who talks about a Catholic child, stop them and say, no, that is a child of Catholic parents. Don't call it a Catholic child.
Great. Okay, so we'll move over to Professor Pinker, and then we've got questions from the audience, and we have one we've selected from Facebook and from Twitter, and then we'll let the professors have closing statements with anything that we might have missed that they would like to leave with us. Okay, so Professor Pinker, we have quite a few questions here for you also. So many people think of science in relation to scientific advances, and such as advances in medicine or technology. And you argue that science is for a much larger, can be used for a much larger products than that. And could you elaborate on that, on the other ways that we could use science to solve problems?
Yes, most people have the stereotype that science is about inventing gadgets, curing diseases, monitoring the environment, a narrow utilitarian focus on the material world, on stuff and bodies. But science is much broader than that. It's really our best attempt to understand the world around us, including the world of other people, including the world of politics and history and economics. I see science as, first of all, being committed to the idea that the world is intelligible, that there are explanations behind phenomena, and also that the search for those explanations is hard, that we are, the human brain by itself is ill-equipped to figure out how the world works. Our brains evolved to solve concrete problems like finding out which plants are safe to eat or how best to trap an animal. They're not so good left to their own devices at figuring out not only how the material world works, where life came from, but why wars start and stop, what drives the crime rate up and down, what's good or bad for the economy or the environment or education. But that science can be applied to these problems, and often it delivers surprises. That when you explicitly acknowledge that our own common sense is likely to be a source of error, that there are enough psychologists have characterized a number of bugs in our cognitive software. By devising workarounds for those bugs, which is what I see science as being the business of doing, you can often be surprised at the state of the world and surprised at what we can do to move the state of the world in directions that we like.
Okay. There are many sources of belief that we appeal to when we want to confirm something that we know to be true is true. Can you say something about these sources like faith and dogma and authority, and what distinguishes sciences from them?
Yeah. The educated, enlightened people today take for granted the idea that it's a good thing to believe things that are true and a bad thing to believe things that are false. Now that sounds almost too obvious to be worth stating, but in general, that's not the way our species works. Our beliefs often tend to be identity badges. Richard referred to the fact that people form coalitions around whether they're wearing an orange t-shirt or a green t-shirt, and as a fan of the Boston Celtics, I can say that there's a psychological potency to wearing a green t-shirt. But people also form coalitions around their beliefs, and you express your loyalty to your teammates, the people you grew up with, your family, your friends, your community, by saying, I believe in this theory or that theory. You ingratiate yourself to charismatic people by saying, oh, what he believes, I'm going to believe that too. So, and indeed, I think it's be fair to say that most of the traditional reasons that human beings have believed things have had very little to do with whether they're true or false. And these include faith, which by definition means believing something for which there is no good reason to believe in it. So I would consider that to be a by definition, a reason to say that faith is bad. Revelation, a seer or visionary believes that they have been vouchsafed with the truth through a divine sense that they alone possess. Dogma, a statement that has been passed down from earlier generations, and you believe it just because your forebears believed it. And dogma is by no means exclusive to religion. There are scientific dogmas, and many of the institutions of science are explicitly designed to try to minimize the all too human tendency to accept something just because other people before you have said it. Authority, people who are powerful, who determine whether you're going to get a raise, who pass laws. Charisma, people who are have a strong jaw, a melodic way of speaking, are tall, have big shoulders, can work a crowd. We tend to believe what they say. That's that being a bad thing. Conventional wisdom, they say. That we believe a lot of things because they say such and such is true. Or that feeling, that glow that we often have when we come across an idea that just seems so exciting and affirming and pleasant to believe in. That entire list that I went through, we know from looking at the errors of people in other times and places that they are unreliable sources of knowledge. They are ways of knowing that we as a species are vulnerable to that cause us to believe things that aren't so. If we want to believe things that are so, well, that's where we turn to those methods that we call science. And by science, I don't mean people with white coats and test tubes. I mean a way of thinking. And the way of thinking is don't trust these traditional sources of knowledge. Try to let the world tell you whether you are right or wrong. Now, part of that technique consists in ingenious experiments in particle accelerators and experiments introducing guppies into ponds with or without predators. But more generally, it's a set of habits, institutions, rules of the game that will try to push your beliefs in the direction of things that are true. And they include things like open debate, peer review, double-blind tests. The fact that in a well-functioning scientific community, a lowly undergraduate with no credentials can legitimately challenge a Nobel Prize winner, ask the Nobel Prize winner to justify what he said. If he can intelligently answer the question of the freshman, then those are grounds for disbelieving the big shot with the Nobel Prize. And everyone has a say, and in that regard, the ideals of science are continuous with the ideals of democracy. That is the idea that there can't be entrenched authority, that policy can't be determined by brute force or raw authority, but it can always be challenged. And that mindset is essential to the scientific worldview.
Okay. A number of cognitive psychologists have talked about the nature of our cognitive limitations. And you discuss various workarounds in relation to these limitations. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean about workarounds?
Yes, one of the most exciting branches of psychology in the last few decades has been the one that characterizes the various bugs in our intuitive statistical reasoning. And it's shown that human beings are pretty crummy intuitive statisticians. A few examples. People are likely to believe in the gambler's fallacy, that if there has been a string of roulette spins in which the ball lands in red, then it's due to land on black. And Las Vegas lives on this fallacy. As if the roulette wheel has a memory of how the ball has fallen and a desire to appear fair. Many people think this is the law of averages, which, by the way, there's no such. Statisticians never talk about the law of averages. There's no such thing. People think of the so-called law of averages as a kind of feedback mechanism where a process tries to achieve its average such that if there are too long a run that veers in one direction, there's a compensating process that pushes it back. Whereas, in fact, the phenomenon behind the law of averages is just dilution. That is, if you've had a lucky run, it's bound not to continue. But on average, in the future, it's going to be swamped by numbers that display the central tendency. Another example is the whole concept of luck. Some people think that, in fact, most people think that they are lucky, that they're less likely to get pregnant from unprotected sex, they're less likely to come down with a disease than the average person, they're less likely to be in a car accident, they're less likely to lose their job. Now, of course, this is mathematically impossible. A majority of people can't be above average, and there's no such thing as luck. The universe does not care about the well-being of individual people. That's one of the greatest scientific discoveries ever made. People tend to be overimpressed by vivid anecdotes. If there is a hijacking, a plane crash, a terrorist attack, a rampage shooting, that will affect people's assessment of how dangerous the world is and where the dangers lie. Just one example is that after 9/11, which probably achieved more news coverage than any event in the last several decades, people were so afraid of dying in a hijacked plane that many drove instead, not realizing that a plane trip from Boston to Los Angeles has the same risk as driving 12 miles. So as a result of people avoiding plane travel so that they wouldn't get crashed into a skyscraper, they drove instead. There are probably about 1,500 extra deaths in the year following 9/11. Because the car crashes dribble in one or two at a time, they're often not reported in the paper at all, or if they are, it's on page 47 below the fold. Whereas the plane crashes, by getting a lot of press coverage and being very vivid and gory and gaudy, burn themselves into our consciousness. We overestimate their probabilities. Those are just a couple of examples of how our sense of the risks of the world can be distorted by bugs in our cognitive software.
Okay, now we'll move on to some really hard questions that we know that you might have an answer for. So you talk about our need to take responsibility for the welfare of ourselves and our species and our planet. What do you mean by this, and how can we actually do this?
If you, stepping back and appreciating the scientific enterprise as a whole, what has science given us? Again, it's given us life-saving drugs. It's made extended people's lifespan. It's reduced mortality. It's given us many precious gifts of everyday existence. But if I were to identify the main achievement of science over the last several hundred years, it is disabusing us of the idea that the universe is enchanted, that there's some kind of benevolent, mind-like presence suffusing matter, spirits in the mountains and in the rivers, and cosmic forces and karma, and an overall intelligence that makes the molecules fall into place, including the ones in our own body, that the universe cares about our happiness. The greatest gift of the scientific revolution in the 17th century is to show that that's not true. Now that might seem depressing. Wouldn't it be nice to know that the brooks are alive and there are spirits in the mountain, that there is an overall purpose to existence? On the other hand, it's really not such a humane force, and it means that we can fob off responsibility on our own well-being and that of our country, our species, our planet, on some kind of cosmic force that doesn't exist. Knowing that the laws of physics really don't care about how happy or healthy we are means that we have to take those problems on and solve them as best as our collective intelligence can do.
Okay, so that's the next question we have. It's on 3 or 4 cards, and I had noted it myself, so we'll be able to take care of a lot of birds here with one stone. So we live in disparaging times, and yet you say that every measure of flourishing is on the rise. What do you mean by that, and how can that be true?
Yes. This is another beautiful example of how human intuition, common sense, cognitive software we inherited can clash with the best understanding of the state of the world that science can provide. We have a bias to see the worst things that happen because that's what news is. News is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. If something blows up, if there's a gunman somewhere, not only will the news agencies converge on the event, but now anyone with a cell phone, which means several billion people, are instant reporters, and they can beam real-time video footage of it all over the planet. If there's some part of the world where things are going right, where there hasn't been a terrorist attack, there hasn't been a rampage shooting, there hasn't been a war for yet another year, there isn't a reporter with a camera saying, well, here I am in the streets of Angola, and there's no war again today. So given that our intuitions are driven by vivid events, we naturally will overestimate the catastrophes. It's only when you count, when you look at the number of opportunities there are for a war to take place, or a riot, or ethnic strife, and then you count out, of those opportunities, how many times was there really a civil war, that you get an accurate picture of the state of humanity. And when you do that, you see that the world is first of all, getting more peaceful. My best estimate is that, say, during World War II, at the height of it, the rate of violent death was about 300 people per 100,000 world population per year. That is, every year during World War II, about one-third of 1% of the population was killed. During the 1950s, the early 1950s, that went down to about 30, from 300 to 30. During the height of the Vietnam War, that was about 10. During the 70s and 80s, that was halved to about 5. In the 21st century, even with Syria, even with Afghanistan, the rate is closer to 1 per 100,000 per year. If you plot it on a graph, you get a kind of a roller coaster, but with an unmistakable downward slope. Likewise, we read, and we should read, about disease and poverty and starvation in the developing world, and they're still appallingly present. On the other hand, if you do your best to count and you plot it over time, you see that literally billions of people have been lifted from poverty, disease, and starvation. If you plot infant mortality globally over time, if you plot extreme poverty by some constant yardstick, if you plot the percentage of people living in democracies, if you plot even small luxuries, like how many people in the world can afford a beer, how many people have cell phones, pretty much every way that you want to quantify human happiness, flourishing, well-being, the curve has been going up. Now, with zigs and zags, and still leaving an enormous percentage of the world in a state for which we ought to try to improve it. But the picture that you get from reading news stories one at a time can be highly misleading in terms of the state of the world.
Okay, well, so we're pretty much on time. So at this point, we'll turn to a couple questions from Facebook and from Twitter. And depending on the topic, I think it's pretty obvious which professor could answer them. But then some of them are quite crossover questions. And then we have some cards from the audience that are original questions that were not already covered in the prepared questions. So we'll start with, this one appears that it could be for both professors, so I'll start with it. It's, should science have any safeguards, controls over what should be developed? They don't say anything other than that, but of course I'm sure that has to do with stem cell research and other controversial areas. So would either one of you like to take a stab at that one?
There ought to be some. I think that it's similar to the question of should there be constraints on freedom of speech in a democracy. And the answer is, say, in a democracy, there are some. You can't deliberately incite a riot. You can't engage in libel. You can't reveal state secrets. On the other hand, we have to be very cautious in imposing free speech, because it is free speech that allows us to do everything else, criticize mistakes, weed out failures. Likewise, in science, there are, I think, a restricted number of cases in which one can legitimately clamp down on scientific inquiry. The harm to human subjects in biomedical research, the creation of or dissemination of knowledge that could lead in deliberately engineered disease organisms that could fall into the hands of terrorists, certain kinds of weapons technology. In those cases, it's just common sense that there ought to be restraints, but they ought to be applied reluctantly and when there's a proven necessity.
Okay. So the next question here is,
Why do you think religion is more prevalent in the U.S. than the rest of the industrialized world?
Where I come from in Britain, we have an established church, the Church of England. The Queen is the head of the Church of England. There are 26 bishops who sit as of right in Parliament in the House of Lords. So Christianity is official. And this country, the United States, was founded in an opposite point of view. Secularism is built into the Constitution for very good reasons. It was, in a sense, much of it was an escape from the evils that were going on due to religious strife and persecution in Europe. So there is no church, there's no official church here, there's no official religion, and there's an official church-state separation. I think it may be that this is the paradoxical cause for the difference that you describe. But this is only one possibility. In Britain, and I think also in the Scandinavian countries, which have an official religion and are among the least religious countries in the world, it could be because religion is official that it's become boring. It's become just the official way that you deal with marriage and death and birth and memorial services and things like that. In America, where there is no official religion, religion has become big business. You have mega churches headed by charismatic evangelists who are, in many cases, transparent charlatans, but who stand up and fool their congregations into giving them money. Money which is used then to buy yet more opportunities for asking for yet more money on buying more television channels and things. And the evangelists have Rolls Royces and Learjets, and it's all tax-free, and they are vying with each other using the weapons of commercial advertising, television and so on, to get congregations to get tax-free tithes. I just wonder whether perhaps this is part of the reason why America has become, perhaps has held on to religion so much more than Western Europe. The exception in Britain, and I think other parts of Western Europe, is Islam, where although Christianity is clearly dying in Western Europe, Islam unfortunately is not.
I think that is one of the reasons we've got a free market in religion, and free markets are good at giving people what they want, for better or worse. I can note two other differences between the United States and Europe in that regard. One of them is that in the history of the United States, in the recent history, religion has played much more of a civilizing force than it has recently in Europe. Those of you who've seen movies of the Wild West and the Mountain South know that a large part of the United States was in a state of anarchy until relatively recently. Europe has had its monarchs and its emperors and kings for literally centuries, but the American frontier was only closed in the 1890s, and they ruled Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Roy Rogers stereotypes captured a bit of reality that the settlers in the United States really got to the land before there was effective governance. And so you had spectacularly high rates of violence in the West and the South. In fact, you still have higher rates there than in the North. And one of the reasons was, as the old cowboy movie said, the nearest sheriff was 90 miles away, so you had to defend yourself with your six-shooter. So you had barroom brawls and gunfights and so on. Well, people generally don't like living in states of high violence and anarchy, particularly women, particularly business people. And in the history of the United States, the church was often touted as the force that would civilize young men, that would get them away from their brawling and boozing and gambling and whoring, get them into the churches on Sunday morning, get them to settle down with a family. And it often did that more effectively. It was the only choice before there was effective region-wide governance. I think that's why it's, especially in the South and the West, that the church is still held in high regard as a source of moral values. Historically, it took on some of that function. Also, there seems to be a correlation across countries that's been documented by a social scientist named Gregory Paul, that the greater the social safety net, the medical insurance, unemployment insurance, the lower the degree of religious belief. You know, compared to other Western democracies, the United States has less of a social and economic safety net. And so people tend to put more stock in prayer, in hoping for God's blessing and God's forgiveness in cases where they are more afraid of losing their job, going without medical coverage, being out in the streets. And so that's yet a third hypothesis to why the U.S. is so different from other Western democracies.
The findings of Gregory Paul apply not just across different countries in the world, but also across different states within the United States. It's a very powerful piece of evidence. On the first point you made, Steve, about the Wild West and the church being a sort of civilizing force, there's a lovely line in Beyond the Fringe, which was a British satirical show, which was a vicar saying, "We must get the violence off the streets and into the churches where it belongs."
Okay, this segues into our next question. It says, please give us your thoughts on blind faith, and I'll combine it with another question that says, what is your response to the question when people ask you, if there is no God, so why should we be good?
What was the key word in the
blind faith.
Blind faith.
Blind faith.
If there is no God, why should we be good? What an astonishingly cynical question. I mean, are we really only good because we're frightened of the big daddy in the sky who will punish us if we're not? I'm afraid that, as is actually true of some people, I was once on a radio talk show in this country, and a man phoned in from Texas and said that if he didn't believe in God, he'd go out and shoot his neighbour. And I said, surely you don't really mean that. Yes, I do, he said. So there may be, I mean, Steve Pinker has an anecdote about when the Montreal police went on strike, and immediately a minority of people started rioting and smashing shop windows and things, which I guess does rather disillusion one's idealism with respect to human nature. But nevertheless, it is not a very noble motive for being good. I'm afraid that many politicians who are not religious themselves buy into the fiction, I hope it's a fiction, that we need religion in order to be good. A little anecdote of my own. In Britain we have a census every 10 years. And in the 2011 census, my British foundation, the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science UK, commissioned a survey, a poll, of people who ticked the Christian box in the census. You have to say what religion you are, including none. And 54% of the British population said they were Christian. That's dropped from 72% in 2001 census, by the way. But we wanted to know whether they were really Christian. So we asked a number of supplementary questions in this poll, only of people who ticked the Christian box. And there are various indicators from that actually they're not at all Christian, they just think they are. So we asked, one of the supplementary questions was, why did you tick the Christian box? And the majority answer, I regret to say, was, well, I like to think of myself as a good person. So there's a fiction that Christian somehow equals good. And even if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in Jesus, you don't believe in the virgin birth, you don't believe in any kind of supernaturalism, nevertheless you call yourself Christian because you think that's the only way to be good. That's what we're up against, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we're up against. This extraordinary fiction, which is so widely believed, even by non-believers in religion, it's so widely believed that you need religion in order to be good. That's palpably not the case when you look at the social mores, the moral presuppositions of people, even just separated by only decades. Steve Pinker documents this over millennia, but even over decades, there's a shifting moral zeitgeist. We are labelled early 21st century people in the sense that we all, to greater or lesser extent, share the same dislike of racism, the same dislike of sexism. We don't believe in slavery, we believe in kindness to non-human animals and so on. If you go back, certainly if you go back to the 19th century, you find people in the vanguard of liberal progressive opinion, like Charles Darwin, like Abraham Lincoln, his exact contemporary, like Thomas Henry Huxley. These men, by modern standards, were racist, sexist bigots. But by their own standards of their own time, they were advanced, progressive liberals. We changed decade by decade. If you read the fiction, even cheap thriller fiction throughout the 20th century, you can pretty much gauge which decade the fiction was written in by the sort of prejudices which the characters show. You'll get rampant racism in the 1920s, for example, which you couldn't possibly get in similar fiction today. In the 19th century, it was widely believed that women shouldn't have the vote because they couldn't think. Women only got the vote in the United States in sometime in the 1920s, was it?
Yeah.
And Britain was the same. Switzerland didn't give the women the vote until as late as the 1970s, I think. We're moving steadily in the right direction. We're labelled with the decade in which we live. This clearly has nothing to do with religion. It's something that's changing in the air as the decades go by. You don't need religion to be good. There's something else that's changing. It's a change in the conversation, in journalism, in legislation, in litigation. There's a change that's in the air, and I call it the shifting moral zeitgeist. It's nothing to do with religion.
And I think we can say a bit more about what the shifting moral zeitgeist is, and I really do think that it is continuous with the scientific mindset, namely you should believe in things that you can justify, things for which you can provide reasons. And in the case of criminal punishment, we'll go back to the Montreal police strike that I grew up with, where the police went on strike and there was mayhem, including two homicides within a few hours. The difference between that kind of punishment and divine retribution is that a police force and a judicial system in a democracy enforce laws that we believe ought to be enforced. That namely, it really isn't a good thing to allow people to assault each other, rape each other, murder each other with impunity. Why? Well, none of us want to be raped or assaulted or murdered, and even though occasionally it might be tempting or convenient to harm someone else, we make a bargain that we would be better off, everyone would be better off if we renounce our right to harm someone in exchange for the protection of not being harmed ourselves. And any system that says, well, I can kill someone who insults me, but no one can kill me, that might seem very compelling to me, but it's not going to be very compelling if I persuade you of it, just because I'm me and you're not. So as soon as you have people in a community where they have to justify their beliefs, say, here's how we all ought to behave, as opposed to me just imposing my will on everyone else, that works as long as I'm strong enough to do it, but it's not going to last very long. Then that's going to push the conversation in certain directions. It's going to push it in the direction of trying to minimize undeniably harmful practices like killing and assaulting and robbing and raping. It's going to eliminate unjust practices that are perpetuated by habit, by loyalty, by faith, by dogma, but which wither under the scrutiny of rational inquiry. The idea that races should be treated differently, the idea that women shouldn't have the right to vote. As soon as you shine a spotlight on it and you say, well, why shouldn't women have the vote? The arguments just aren't going to last very long because they're crummy arguments. And as long as you have a commitment to justifying your practices, justifying your beliefs, I believe it's going to go, the practices are going to go in a certain direction. That direction is going to be one where there's less violence, because violence is inherently a bad thing, more equality of opportunity, and the other positive developments we've been seeing. You can even scientifically say why violence is a bad thing. Namely, that why would it be so bad for me to get what I want by harming someone who has something that I'd rather take for myself? Well, it's the advantage to the exploiter, to the aggressor, is outweighed by the cost to the victim. That's just because a human body is a complex thing. There are a lot more things that can go wrong than can go right. In general, to destroy something subtracts value from the world. Given that aggressors can become victims and vice versa over long stretches of time, we really are better off preventing exploitation, violence, and harm. And that's why societies, when they have the opportunity to create laws and enforcement on a rational basis, try to minimize violence.
Okay, great. So we've got 3 cards left. We'll get these questions in. Do you think global warming is causing animals to become extinct, and what can be done about this?
There seems very little doubt about that. Yes, it seems to be happening. It does seem to be caused by inadvertent human agency. What can be done about it? It's one thing to say what scientifically what should be done about it. It's another thing to mobilize the political will to do something about it, especially when you have separate points of view from all over the world. It's a very difficult problem. It's a matter of raising consciousness. I think it doesn't help that you have powerful, vocal, well-financed lobbies attempting to deny that human agency is causing global warming.
Okay. Is there a genetic basis for homosexuality?
There seems to be, statistically, there is seems to be some genetic tendency, but it is very far from 100%. It's identical twins who share all their genes are likelier to be have the same sexual orientation. That is, if you have one identical twin brother, the chances that the other identical twin will also be gay are much higher than the base rate of the population, which is about 3%. But it's nowhere near 100%. You can have identical twins, one of whom is gay, one of whom is straight. And I think it's still a scientific mystery what makes people gay or straight, above and beyond the fact that there are these genetic statistical influencers. There are some other risk factors in having to do with pregnancy that can be identified. But by and large, it's still unknown.
Okay. What are the 2 or 3 most exciting research areas right now? I think this could be answered by you, Professor Dawkins, and then Professor Pinker. 2 or 3, if you were beginning your studies now, which field would you want to enter? The most exciting research areas?
Well, there are no doubt extremely exciting ones in physics, which I'm not qualified to talk about. I'm extremely moved when I go to great physics establishments like CERN in Geneva. So there are huge unknowns in physics which are waiting to be discovered. In biology, I think the molecular genetics revolution which started in 1953 with Watson and Crick, is utterly astounding. And what it's shown is that genetics is it's a branch of computer science, it's a branch of information technology. With hindsight, one could probably say that it had to be that way in order for evolution by natural selection to work. But it is nevertheless a truly wonderful fact that molecular genetics is a digital phenomenon, and that has enormous ramifications in the whole of biology, in medicine, in academic biology, in taxonomy. It's extremely exciting. As for unsolved mysteries, well, the origin of life I've already mentioned, and that's a very important area of research which may never be solved because it happened so far in the past. And the nature of human consciousness, something to do with what goes on in the brain, but it's a deeply mysterious question, how that gives rise to these subjective sensations of pain, of colour, of hue, etc., that we all privately experience but can't really communicate how we feel to others.
What about you, Dr. Pinker?
I would identify within my own field of cognition, psychology, social science, I would identify the study of the human moral sense, the idea that our feelings of right and wrong and moral norms and taboos are like color vision or hearing. They are part of our brain. They evolved for a purpose. They might systematically lead us astray. We may have moral illusions, things where we have a burning sense of what's right and wrong that have very little to do with what is right or wrong according to our best argumentation. The better we understand where our moral intuitions come from, the better equipped we'll be to refine them and purify them and justify them. And it's also just a fascinating aspect of human nature. The other endeavor that excites me is a kind of Moneyball approach to the world, to politics and to history. Moneyball referring to the bestseller describing the process by which quantificational statistical thinking in the Oakland Athletics baseball team 15 years ago led them to a World Series despite being underfunded compared to other teams, that by throwing away superstition, received wisdom, common sense, stereotypes, impression, and surely focusing on the numbers, you could attain a winning record for a relatively impoverished baseball team. So I'll use the term Moneyball to refer to the idea that understanding history, politics, current events, policy could be put on a much better basis if we tried to quantify, if we did our best to ascertain cause and effect, weeding out the superstitions and false beliefs from more evidence-based, justified policies and theories.
Okay, so our final question that we received from the audience, which is like it's well suited for either our both professors, and it's a good wrap-up question also. It says, what advancements, moral or otherwise, would you like to see occur to assure our survival, flourishing, and well-being of the human race? You've already stated a lot of reasons, but if you have any final thoughts on our survival.
I guess I'll I suppose reiterate my some of the themes that I've mentioned throughout this discussion. One of them is that to the best that we can, we should make our beliefs correspond to the truth. It sounds kind of like embracing motherhood, but it really isn't, because so many of our beliefs are identity badges showing that we belong to the right coalition. And to open our minds, to be prepared to have our minds be changed by evidence, to be forced to justify our beliefs, to be able to criticize other beliefs, to be forced to defend our own. That is where I think hope for humanity lies in the most generic sense.
I would agree with that, except to say that it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to find the political means to implement it. And it's very difficult, and democracy is what is wonderful, but it does have its drawbacks, and it's extremely difficult sometimes to get that kind of totally sensible point of view mobilized in the political real world.
Okay, so that was our final question. Please join me in a round of applause for we were told by the authorities that we couldn't pass out books in here, but we have Professor Dawkins' book outside, Appetite for Wonder, and we purchased Professor Pinker's book, Better Angels. What is it, about 800 pages? It was like a big book, and there was a delay in the shipping, so everyone here, we're taking your names and addresses, and we'll ship you that book as soon as it comes into our office. And but Professor Dawkins' book is outside, Appetite for Wonder, and you can pick up your copy there. And thank you very much.